So we're here talking Ukraine with the award-winning journalist Aaron Mate, mate.substack.com. And this was Anti-War, which is a great Twitter, and they do great work. You guys should check it out. The U.S. is still not trying diplomacy with Putin to stop fighting in Ukraine. Biden administration's strategy is to inflict as much economic pain on Russia as possible and to flood Ukraine with weapons, and that's by Dave DeCamp. Over at antiwar.com, and let me just read to you what he wrote. He says, Secretary of State Antony Blinken claimed that in months leading up to the invasion, the U.S. gave Putin possible off-ramps. But during the negotiations, the U.S. ignored Putin's key demands. Putin wanted a guarantee that Ukraine wouldn't ever join NATO, and even though President Biden said Kiev wouldn't be joining the military alliance anytime soon, the U.S. refused to make them a promise. Now, Russia has said it will stop its assault if Ukraine declares neutrality, recognizes Crimea as Russian territory, and recognizes the independence of the breakaway Donbass republics. Instead of supporting negotiations on these terms that could lead to a potential ceasefire, the U.S. is working with its NATO allies to flood weapons into Ukraine. Blinken said on Wednesday that the Biden administration expects a strategic defeat of Russia in Ukraine despite Moscow's short-term gains. We'll accomplish this by backing Ukrainians in their fight, by remaining united in holding Russia accountable through the devastating sanctions, the diplomatic isolation, and other measures, Blinken said, while Blinken says the U.S. expects a Russian defeat in Ukraine. Biden officials told the Post that that's a lie, just so you know. They don't expect that. Biden officials told the Post that they don't see a clear end to the military phase of this conflict, meaning the U.S. expects a long, bloody insurgency in Ukraine and is willing to support it. So here's what Caitlin Johnstone tweeted out. De-escalation is a skill we're meant to start learning in kindergarten. These people act like they learned their de-escalation skills in the Minneapolis Police Department. So let me bring you in, Aaron. What do you think the United States is trying to de-escalate? Because I don't think they are. And what do you think?
The fact that Blinken can say that we expect Russia to be defeated in Ukraine just shows how much contempt him and his administration colleagues have for the Ukrainian people. That they're sending Ukraine to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. Policy all along. As Dave DeCamp of antiwar.com points out, there were sensible Russian proposals. Russia wasn't asking to colonize Ukraine or even to actually control the Donbass part of Ukraine. Russia was willing to recognize the Donbass as being a part of Ukraine if it could be granted some limited autonomy. That was Russia's proposal, and also taking NATO off the table. So not putting Ukraine inside a Russian military bloc, but also not putting it inside a U.S.-led military bloc, which is such a reasonable solution, especially when you have such a divided country, and especially given that Ukraine is on Russia's borders, and to have a hostile military alliance on the borders of a nuclear-armed state is just a recipe for suicide. And now we know from reporting in the Washington Post and the Times that as Russia was making the U.S. and Ukraine were preparing for an insurgency, there were going to Ukraine and training being done to prepare for an insurgency inside Ukraine. So the Biden administration strategy was clearly, they knew that this was a red line for Russia. They knew that if they rejected it, that Russia would most likely invade. And that's exactly what happened. And now, instead of taking the off-ramps, they just want to see more Ukraine get destroyed in the hope that they can turn this into another Afghanistan for Russia like they did to Russia, to the Soviet Union back in the 1980s with the Mujahideen, again using far-right extremists as the drivers of the insurgency.
Okay, so yes. So again, this has been provoked by the West. We don't really want an end to this conflict right away, and we want to drag it out. Right? Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
The fact that Blinken is claiming that he thinks that Ukraine will defeat Russia is just, it's madness, because everyone knows, and this is not, it doesn't take a genius to see this. Russia has an overwhelming military advantage just by virtue of their size and where they are, that they can overpower whatever Ukraine does, even if the U.S. is in. So Blinken's he's basically, just like they dangled NATO, even though they knew how difficult it would be to actually bring Ukraine into NATO, Blinken is now also dangling this fantasy of a military victory for Ukraine inside of Russia. When again, as awful as the Russian invasion has been so far, and they've committed many crimes, it could get even worse unless there's a diplomatic off-ramp that is found and a serious negotiation, and that revolves around letting Ukraine be neutral and stop trying to make it a NATO proxy state. And so far, the Biden administration wants to just keep fighting, wants to keep using Ukrainians as cannon fodder.
And people don't realize that.